Saying earlier, this book is just amazing to me, but let's start with just a quick word of prayer, if you'll join me. God of all, we are thinking about how you are real and how you are a mystery and how our lives move along in order to learn more about you. We ask that as we read this book by this remarkable and wise follower of you, that you help us follow in our own lives where we may be more connected to you or to others on the journey. In Christ's name we pray. Amen. All right. Well, so chapter 3, God is real and is a mystery. Even the title, I think, is kind of interesting. But he's talking, this is the third thing he's talking about on how his convictions came about. And he talks about kind of an experience that was sort of outside his realm of normal experience. And I didn't know if any of you may have had what some people would call a supernatural experience or some sort of a lightning strike. Has anybody had something like that?
I mean, other than the day I met Jan? Just kidding.
Oh.
Okay.
Oh, are you here, Jan? I'm sorry.
You know, I think sometimes maybe not as significant as his, but sometimes in connecting with nature or being outside, where I am right now, there was this enormous snowstorm coming across the mountains toward us here in the valley, and it was awe-inspiring to look at, and it kind of lifts you out of yourself. You know, you have this sense that there are some incredible powers in the universe, and it's not me. I can't remember who someone said. There's some writer who said, I finally realized there was a God and it isn't me. But well, anyway, so he talks about when people have these experiences that there are two kind of meanings in them. One is that it's a sort of connectedness, and the other is that it's an illumination. So I think we get illumination in different ways. We get it from experiences like his, but he also goes on and talks about the cloud of witnesses. And that's the question that I want to pose to you tonight. So that's a term we hear from the Bible, but also we hear quite a lot. And I am curious, when he talks about there's a cloud of witnesses, Christian and non-Christian too. I thought it was interesting that he said non-Christian too. I'm curious, in your life, who has been a witness or who has really affected your faith? And I hope you thought about that this week. And I'm willing to leap out there and tell you about one of mine. So after my mom passed away, both my parents had passed, but she had one living sister, my Aunt Quintilla, who was the fifth child. That's how she got the name Quintilla. And I called her one day, kind of out of the blue, and I said, gee, I've just been thinking about you. How are you doing? And she said, oh, Janet, I have been praying to God to send me someone, and he sent me you. Wow. And I wanted to go, wait, this is Janet, right? I just called to see how you're doing. And, you know, anyway, she was really in desperate straits. She was quite elderly. She was getting ill. She was financially strapped. So I began to help her. And it went on for years. It was trying to help her live more independently, finally realizing she couldn't drive, selling her car, finding her a nursing home, helping her through that transition, and then years and years in the nursing home. And it was hard duty to walk those last years with her, and hard to carve out the time. She lived a couple hundred miles away. It was increasingly hard to satisfy her, and even hard to talk to her because she grew more and more deaf. But as she came closer to death, that's when she had always been a Christian woman. And I remember as a kid, her taking me to Sunday school class where she was a teacher, but it made me realize that we teach many things to others in our lives, or we witness many things. And one of the things we witness is how to die. And her death was quite a sermon. It was long and slow and pain-filled. But I had a real insight into what it means to be a Christian facing death, because it was passing, certainly, and a leaving behind and grief and all of those things, but she was longing to go home. It was not, she didn't think about dying, right? She thought about going home. She was reaching for it, just straining for it, and just ready, really ready, and not in any fearful way. Just, she would say, she couldn't hear very well, but she could still talk, and she would say, "Oh, I think it's nearly time." And she would be smiling. It was just amazing to me. And at her funeral, all I could think of over and over was, "Well done, good and faithful servant," because she always was. But anyway, pardon me, that was really a witness to me about a Christian in a really tough time. I mean, she was old and weak and sick and, going through all that, but her faith was incredible, and it was contagious, I think. So she was one in my cloud. So I'm sure there have been people in your lives that have witnessed to you in big and little ways, and I'd love to hear about some of them.
I was a minister on staff at a church in Houston, and we were very near the medical center, and we received a phone call from a woman. I think she was in Missouri, but she was calling about a man who had been at MD Anderson, a young guy who was being treated for cancer. And he was flying home. His home was in Birmingham, and this woman was a friend of his in-laws or something. At any rate, this guy from MD Anderson had gone to the airport where he had passed out and began bleeding from his ears. And he didn't know where he was. I mean, he was passed out at that point. And we heard that they had sent him to a hospital, and the people were frantic to get somebody to him because his wife was in Birmingham, his in-laws were in Missouri, and an uncle from somewhere in West Texas was supposed to be driving. And I told my friend who was on call that night, I said, "If you can find him, I'll sit with him." And so we finally found the hospital he was in, and I went in, and this man was in, was a young guy in his 30s, married, had 3 little kids, and he was obviously very, very ill. And I went to him and I said, "You don't know me, but I'm going to hold on to all your stuff, and I'm going to sit here with you until your uncle comes." And so, for a while, periodically we would pray. Sometimes we would hold hands, but essentially I was just there with him. And any person who came into the room, the change of shift or something, would come in and would talk to him, and then they'd say to me, "And who are you?" And I'd say, "Well, I'm a minister of this church here. I'm just sitting with him until his uncle gets here." This went on and on and on. This was now about 3 o'clock in the morning, and his wife was able to get him transferred back to MD Anderson. So we knew an ambulance was going to come take him. And I said to him, "I will follow the ambulance back to MD Anderson. I'll hold all your stuff, your wallet and all that. And I will stay with you till your uncle comes." And again, the ambulance crew came in and went through this same drill, explaining to him they were going to take him, put him in the ambulance, all this. And they turned to me and they said, "Who are you?" And the man in the bed said to them, "She's my friend." And I think that was the most profound understanding I ever had of what I was called to do. And, I later learned he died 3 weeks later. He never knew my name. None of that was important.
Thank you, Gail. And I think that's an interesting example too of how sometimes the people that are witnesses in our lives are not people we know well. You know,
Yeah.
it's a chance encounter or a crossing of paths, or in your case, a crisis for somebody, but it doesn't necessarily have to be somebody we've known all our life. Anybody else? Who's been a Christian witness to you?
Well, Bob Bryan certainly was. I mean, he was a Methodist pastor, and but a bit out of the mold. And watching what he did with the least of these, I feel like he particularly paid attention to. Well, he was doing LGBT things and marrying people of other faiths and all kinds of things way back, and has always stood as a model to me of what a Christian is to be.
Thank you, Sally. And that's, you know, as I listen to you, I think sometimes they change our view, they expand our view of what a Christian can be. They make it bigger, make it more inclusive. It sounds like he definitely did.
Well, he was also a counselor and did extra training in that regard after he was no longer on a church staff. And I mean, he accepted and in every way people who were out of the ordinary and might be considered unacceptable.
What a blessing. All of us who've been out of the ordinary just, oh, can't wait to meet that guy. You know?
Well, he's now deceased. He died in his early 90s, I guess. He was on the staff at University Methodist at one time, and then he ran the Wesley Foundation for many years. And then he started New Life Institute, that's a Methodist affiliated counseling entity that's still going on.
Well, there are more like him out there, and I hope some of them are in this group.
This is on a national level and certainly not a personal level, but just seeing someone live out what true Christian values. I have very deep, great admiration for President Obama. I just think he had to take so much abuse with racial jokes about him and being the first, and he seemed to always respond with kindness, with a sense of humor, and never and you know always went high when they went low, always consistently, and I think he's a great example, Christian example.
Yeah, and I think he's an example too of kind of living it out without saying huge amount. I mean, he was not a Bible thumper or anything. It was more his life and his actions as a witness. That's a good example. I like that.
That's one of the reasons I come to church, is to get the benefit of all you folks. And truly, that's what, in large part, what Sunday school class is to me. Week in and week out, it's fairly mundane, but it's also sharing experiences and learning from each other, you know, how it is we're supposed to walk. All of that just, I think, adds up. You know, probably the first experience that I remember, I was 10, and it was my mom. My brother, who was about 8 years older than me, had a paper route, and he got cold cocked by some punk while he was delivering papers and broke his jaw. And a couple of days, and he was, you know, had it locked for a month or whatever. And a couple of days later, that guy came over. His parents came with him, and they made him come over to the house and apologize. And he did it in our living room. And I remember watching, you know, from behind my mom, pretty mad at this guy. And she was explaining that we forgive. Sometimes it's very, very hard to forgive, and I'm struggling with that right now. But that's what we believe, and we'll find a way. It was quite a lesson to a 10-year-old, a 10-year-old boy, for that matter. Small but impressionable.
Imagine, and I don't know about you, Pete, but it'd be harder to forgive for my child than for myself.
Yeah.
I'll give a shout out to Pastor Kathy, and I've only known her for about a year, but watching her at Feed My People is absolutely one of the most inspiring things I've done this year. She knows so many of the people who come by name, and she knows their stories, and she knows what they need, and she knows what's been going on in their lives recently. And I just think it's so, I think it must be really isolating to live on the street and to have someone know you as well as she does, and to have that familiar face once a week. It's such a gift that she gives people.
And interesting, Becca, that she's giving to them but touching you. A double witness. And I think that happens often. Anyone else?
I was just thinking that quote that's attributed to St. Francis of Assisi, which is, "We are called to proclaim the gospel at all times, and sometimes even with words."
Yes.
Use words if necessary.
Yes.
That's true. Okay, well, we'll move on. So Borg frames Christianity as not about beliefs alone. And he says on page 51, being a Christian isn't primarily about having a correct theology. It's about a deepening relationship with God. And I'm just curious, does this view match what you've experienced in your Christian beliefs over time? And how does it focus on just theology rather than our own beliefs weaken Christianity, or does it? What do you think about that? Being Christian isn't primarily about having a correct theology. It's about a deepening relationship with God.
You say page 51?
It's on 51, yeah, page 50. I'm sorry, it's on page 50.
Okay, yeah. And he says, as known especially in Jesus.
Yes.
I like to refer back to Facebook whenever I can, as I learned so much from Facebook. I'm being sarcastic, but there was a post one time, somebody, it said something to the effect that God cares about theology, about like birds care about ornithology. Not that much, but I like the concept of relationship. And personally, I come at it more from a theology perspective, a very poor theology and layperson theology. I think the relationship thing is something to work on, and that would be the goal. I envy people that have a working or speaking or communicating, a living relationship, and have found that with God.
Yes, ditto to all of that, Pete.
Now he talks about how theology can separate us from connection. You know, that you're kind of focused on the theory and the whole, that's where you get into the, well, if there's a almighty God, how can these bad things happen, right? All of those kind of things that wind up pushing people away from religion or belief. So I think it's a thing that we have, it's a weapon we have to use very carefully. But I would guess all of us grew up in a church that said, this is how you believe and this is what it means. And I'm just curious from there to hear what's changed for you. Think about what you were taught maybe as a child or a teenager that you do or do not believe now? And what's the difference there?
I don't know if I can answer that question, but what this topic brings to mind to me, when I went to seminary, what drew me was the intellectual part of it and trying to understand and put into words what I believed, because what I had heard was more a conservative understanding. And then I wanted to learn this other way of talking about it and explaining it. But then what my professors were all saying was that wasn't the most important thing. You just believing liberal things about Christianity versus believing conservative things really didn't get you very far, and that they would always distinguish between belief about, which was this kind of explaining it all, and belief in, and that's, I think, what Borg's talking about. It's what would you trust? Who do you trust, and what do you trust and put your life in? And that was always much harder for me. It's a lot easier to talk about beliefs and what my beliefs are versus somebody else's beliefs. But when it came to whether I trusted in God and that relationship with God, I don't think a liberal theology helps you any better than a conservative theology. That's a really different thing, and what it's really all about.
So it seems like the attractive thing about theology is if you want to kind of pin it down, get the why and this means this kind of explanation, theology can do that for you. But I hear what you're saying about it that might or might not help you to believe. And I think that's what he's talking about in this chapter, right? Is what got him from the intellectual to more the heart spiritual connection. And it came in different ways. That's kind of what I'm asking you guys about. Who in your life has made you kind of think and see God differently, especially from where you may have started?
I can't even remember exactly who it was, but it was, I think it was someone at the Christian Faith and Life community in the Laos House, which had a strong influence on University of Texas, small group of University of Texas students, and then lay people in the Austin area. Back, all the way back to the late 50s into the 60s. I grew up maybe because I was the sixth child I was born in the middle of the Depression, and I spent my whole life never asking for anything unless I was sure that it would be possible for me to get it, because I didn't want to disappoint anybody, and I wanted to be perfect and not to be any trouble to my mother, who had a hard life. And it was at the Christian Faith and Life community. So I was working. I had a good life by then, but I thought I had to really work and be, if not perfect, really, really good to deserve everything I had. And to be sure, I don't think it was even to be sure that God loved me. It was because I was blessed and I had to live a really great life to deserve it. And it was at the Christian Faith and Life community, reading a paper that Sally mentioned last week, You Are Accepted, a sermon by Paul Tillich. And I don't remember who was leading that night. And I kept saying, well, I know I'm accepted, but I know I'm accepted, but, and I don't even remember what the leader said. But at some point, he helped me know that I could just stop there. I know I am accepted, and live into that truth. And that was a huge point for me, where I moved from thinking I had to be perfect to know all the answers to living with that grace, which somehow I missed, even though I saw it in many people. But that was the moment, and isn't it amazing? I don't remember who that witness was.
That's what we're talking about, right? Sometimes we can't recall or might not know intimately somebody that really changed something for us. And you make me think, Kathleen, he talks quite a bit about giving up the whole earning your way to heaven thing, right?
Yeah.
This whole, you've got to be perfect in order to get into heaven. And I'm just curious who had that in their background, and what made you, or have you, set it aside? Anybody raised with in order to get to heaven, you got to do this background?
Not only that, but that's the whole point, is to get to heaven.
Right.
At least that's what we were taught.
And what made you change it, Pete?
Theology. Marcus Borg and folks like that.
Yeah.
I think the way to a really horrible way of living is the idea that you either have to be perfect or to continually atone for something or something. I just think that's a real recipe for disaster in one's life. Because my God, none of us are anywhere near that. One of the things I was thinking about, and I thought about this for some reason the last couple of days, one of the things that ministers in this church have brought to me in a special way is I kind of grew up believing when you prayed, somehow you kind of looked out the window up into the sky, because God was the big man in the sky looking down on you and everything. And realizing that's not my theology any longer. I close my eyes and kind of think about myself in interior and working on that, and that it's not the big man in the sky concept. And I found myself doing that, and I kind of almost surprised myself when I saw that I was doing it. But ministers talk a lot about that. That may be real elementary and simple, but it made a big difference to me.
Yeah, he mentioned in the last couple of chapters we were reading that all of us are raised parochially, right? We're raised by people in whom we have confidence and faith. We have no reason to doubt what they tell us, and different things, images that you get, like God is in the sky, or you've got to be perfect, or this is what you have to do to make it to heaven. Those are kind of things we're drawn to and built up in, and we have to really weigh them. And I think when people weigh them, that's when they either come down to resorting their thoughts, or often they leave their faith altogether. And I'm just curious, do any of you know people who've kind of come to that, I just can't believe this anymore, and left? And what was that like for them, or what was it like for you?
I have friends who, and this frustrates me because their only idea of Christianity is what they learned. They're either Catholic and they were forced to learn some stuff that they couldn't understand, or they were raised with an idea of this kind of menacing God that is going to spite you if you don't do it, and they stop there, and they won't listen to the idea that maybe there's another way of explaining about this God that might be more receptive to them, but they're not really willing to hear that. It's the same frustration I get when I read the 2 or 3 authors that are big on the atheism and explaining why it's so bad, because they always set up this straw man God and then knock that God down, but they don't ever take on the God that Marcus Borg is talking about. And Borg, I think, talks in one of these chapters about the fact that some, he has all these students that come to him and say, I don't believe in God, and he always goes, well, tell me about the God you don't believe in, and that God is always this God that, and Borg always says, well, I don't believe in that God either, and you go from there. But my friends aren't willing to go from there. They don't want to hear about another kind of God.
So what makes people get stuck there? Why is it easier to reject than to go further? Any thoughts on that?
I think it's part of all of us not wanting to kind of look inside ourselves. They've kind of figured out how they think the world works, and if it's science or whatever they put their trust in, that's brought them some comfort. And when something else happens later in their life that they can't answer, then maybe they're presented with it again. But as long as kind of life rolls on, I think you want to mess with what's working for you, type thing.
Yeah. No, I think that's often true. They've kind of got it settled and they don't want it unsettled. It's
Right.
I don't know if you've ever had it settled and then had it unsettled. I've had that sometimes. It's very uncomfortable and a lot of work.
Well, my son and daughter-in-law, who are some of the best people you'll find. David was raised in this church. Sue was raised in the Congregational church. And I think, as like Kurt said, they got to some point where they rejected it all and have not chosen to go deeper into study like we have. And they have busy lives. And for me, I realized a lot of why we came to First Methodist, and the Sunday school class became family and support, and still is. Dave and Sue have founded in a group of neighborhood friends of 5 couples, 13 kids, that's to this day have dinner together every Thursday night. The adults do. That has been their nucleus, like the Sunday school class has been for me. Well, for me, it was the class that led into so much of this other study. And they just haven't had occasion to do that.
Yeah, you make a good point about study. So, I mean, all of you are here studying a book, right? What brings you to study? What caused you to want to study?
I always want to know others think, who've really, there's some people who are just supposed to sit and think and write and talk about it. And I want to hear what they have to say.
I think I
I
will
think
always want to approach things from different angles. I want to see, read things or study things where a light is shined from a place I hadn't thought of.
So you're open to new ideas and new points of view.
Mostly.
You haven't got it settled and don't want it unsettled.
Well, and for me, one thing leads to another. I mean, reading in this book, and then here I was looking up, trying to understand the difference in pantheism and panentheism. And once you read one of the books that Kathy's group did on racism, my word, you're just led to read so much more and feel so stupid for not having been aware of things. So there's other things in this book that, I keep looking up, and I'm sure I will follow up on.
I think I know just enough to know that I don't know much of anything. And that's what draws me to wanting to hear something different, something new. And like Sally, just one thing leads to another, to another, to another. And I'm pleased that I'm at least open to that.
Yeah, I'm hearing openness, and I'm hearing kind of an intellectual humility too, right? To know what other people are thinking and what prior people have thought, and be willing to listen to those ideas. And I think when, from what Kurt was saying, and I interestingly have a young woman that I mentored many years ago in the Methodist Church, and she's taken a really hard turn to the right, and she's very, very conservative, evangelical, and I want to know what alien abducted her. But it's amazing to me from when I knew her to where she is now. I don't know how that happened, but I'm hoping maybe some curiosity or something will open her to some more ideas. But I think what Kurt was saying made me think of her. It's settled. One thing when she was in my classes or I was working with her, she really struggled with what's the answer? What's the answer? What's the answer? And I think that's the thing that a lot of conservative sects give you is, this is the answer. This is it. There's no other answer. This is it. And it's very comforting to her. And I think there's different kinds of comfort. There's that kind of comfort. There's comfort of our community that supports us or whatever. And it just makes me think of how often catastrophe or risk or some big upheaval in people's lives makes them turn and suddenly be open where they weren't before, or seek the church or seek God when before they were not open to it. So I often think of that phrase. I think it's St. Augustine who sometimes refers to God as the hound of heaven, that he is always after you. It's just a question of when he's going to catch you.
Yeah.
Anything else on that?
I think people are different. Some people, like you were saying, I think like certainty, and that draws them a different direction. Some of us are a little bit more able to deal with conflict and hold two conflicting thoughts together. But at the end of the day, it's whatever gets you there. There's any number of ways to the mountaintop. And if you have a conservative theology, yet you wind up loving other people and serving other people and have a relationship with God, that's okay. If you grow up, and I think part of what I think Borg was getting at in terms of the parochial stuff is wherever you grow up, that's the religion you grew up with, that's where you're going to go. And if it works for you, that's okay. I wouldn't expect people who are near starvation to feel the same way about all this stuff as those of us who have, it never even registers with us. We never think about where our next meal is coming from. In fact, to the extent that they can get there, I think is a credit to them. One of the nice things about the stage of life I'm in right now is I have more time to do this kind of study, and it's wonderful. This is the good stuff.
Yeah.
One thing that the Monday night group that Pete and I both attend is that I've learned that that you've got to learn to accept that other people aren't going to change. The idea that, when I read Marcus Borg, I think, man, he's saying exactly what I would say if I knew how to say it. It takes everything I know and it puts it together. And there are other people that will read that and say, oh man, I just can't stand Marcus Borg. I just don't believe anything that he's saying. I think he's trying to take us down the wrong path. And I've had to learn that my job isn't to make that person see why they should love Marcus Borg. It's how do I love that person who professes to be a Christian and whose Christian faith is everything to them, but see it a different way. It's so much easier to love people that believe the same way I do.
Mm-hmm. Amen to that.
hearing you talk about that group reminds me that about study and about change in belief, I think for so many people is entwined with relationship. If you trust the people you are studying with, if you trust the person who's leading, and if that person is, just as Kurt and Pete have said, about not trying to make you believe something, but if the relationships are good, the chances of growing and understanding and changing are so much better. I think it's Karl Barth who said the Bible is the church's book, and that meant it's not for me to take and sit alone and interpret alone. That it's for the community to test one another by, and to be accountable to one another. And I think our exploration and study of the faith is like that. We need one another.
I heard someone say once, you made me think of it, is that it's almost impossible to be a Christian hermit, because so much of Christianity calls you in relationship and calls you into the world. That it's harder and almost impossible to both be a hermit and a Christian. I just thought that was an interesting thought.
Yeah, I think Carl Manger had a book titled "You Can't Be Human Alone," and I always hear that as, and you can't be Christian alone.
Well, I don't want to run out of time to talk about chapter 4, which was all of these. I have to tell you, when I first looked at this, and they said, "So how many weeks do you want to teach it?" And I said, "Oh, well, 10." But I was afraid no one would ever sign up. But that would be a chapter every week, so I just don't want to lose chapter 4 here. So he's talking about salvation is more than life. Is more about this life than an afterlife. So that's his theme here. And he talks a lot about, goes through a different triad than the memories, conversions, convictions he talked about early on. He talks about pre-critical naivete. So this is kind of what we just are taught as a child, that we believe without really criticizing it. And then the beginning of critical thinking, and in his own experience, that was sort of when science began to make him wonder about his faith and was it real. And he makes a comment that modern Western ways of thinking are very much shaped by the identification of truth with factuality, right? That whole, it's got to be real for me to believe it. And then what he called post-critical affirmation, which is kind of where he is after his work. And he wants to talk about salvation and what it really looks like here on earth. And then he gives, and it's in those questions that I sent you, he gives several different ways that people are transformed. Liberation from bondage, return from exile, finding light in the darkness or sight to the blind, life to the dead, food and drink, being saved from sin. And I guess my question to you is, pick one of these, and is there a story in your life or your family or your experience that helps, where you have either witnessed or experienced yourself release from some kind of bondage, experience a certain salvation because of something that happened? I'll give you an example of something that happened for me, and it was really a very slow, weird thing, but I'm sure many of you have been on a walk to Emmaus, but when I went on mine, after it was over, I was thinking about that and what came out of it for me. And a couple of things came to mind. One is how rare it is for us to take 2 or 3 days away from our life to do nothing but think about our relation with God, and that was really an important thing. And then the second was that what happened there for me was I gave up controlling the world. which I was actually pretty good at. I was one of those, I can do it and I can do it, make an A and put a ruffle on it, that kind of thing. But it was also a very stressful and unhappy kind of life. And I really worked through what that was, and that it was trying to control so many things, even myself, that was so difficult. And so it was kind of a mushy, it wasn't a thunderclap kind of a change. But what I have found is that I have, through that experience, become much more patient, much more able to listen to other people, much more able to deal with failure and accept real effort or small advances as success. And that would have been something that would be hard for me before. But I found that to be a kind of liberation from bondage of perfectionism, right, and success. So I don't know if you have similar experiences, but I'd love to hear about if one of these struck a chord with you.
I'm waiting for somebody else to talk because I've talked a lot. I'll just say quickly, I love those metaphors. Some I heard, I was familiar with, some not, and I just think they're wonderful. And I've already said in the other section, I mean, almost all of those have had meaning for me at different times because it happens over and over again. You get saved from whatever it is you need to be saved from, saved for something else. And I think the story I told earlier illustrates liberation from the bondage of having to be perfect, know all the answers, and instead relying on the fact that I'm loved, however a mess I am.
Yeah, and Kathleen, I think you make a good point that probably if we think about it for a while, several of these or 2 or 3 of these might have applied to us, that there have been different times when something happened that was liberating or helpful or freed us from something.
That fed us when we were starving, or, I loved all those.
One of the things I love about the way he always talks about those kind of things is he shows you that the Bible had 5 or 6 or 7 different ways of that it spoke about something like salvation, whereas we tend to learn that there was one way of salvation, or there was one way of this and one way of that, and that the Christian faith is just all about forgiveness, or the Christian faith is all about going to heaven, or Christian. And he's not saying, oh no, you're wrong, it's not that. He's saying he's always saying it's that and there's other things in it. I remember when I was in school, liberation theology was big, and a lot of people were saying, well, that's too narrow. But yeah, maybe it's too narrow if that's the only message of the Bible, but it certainly was the message for a lot of people, and that's how Christians in a lot of places came to their faith was through that idea of liberation. And so that's again what I like so much about Borg. But again, not everybody feels the same way. You talked about Emmaus. Most people have that same reaction of feeling that love from all different directions and acceptance and stuff. But I've been reminded a couple times on Emmaus that where people are in their life and what got them there can change how they view that. I remember there was this woman that I knew sort of she'd been in a marriage where they weren't very religious, and her husband had all of a sudden become very religious and was going to go back and go to seminary, I think. And she was not happy with that. And she went on Emmaus in hopes of finding out what this was all about. And she had a totally different reaction to it. That part where where all the people come I forget which night it is, but all the people from the community come and are there. She felt like she was a hostage being presented to this group, and it dawned on me, oh my gosh, how could you feel that? But it all has to do with how you experience something, and that's why it's so important, I think, to have these different ways of salvation, because different ways are going to speak, different things are going to speak to you, particularly at different moments in your life.
I agree. And he really, in this chapter, he really broadens what salvation means, I think. When you call it transformation and then list it in all these different ways, it's a whole nother way of looking at what being saved might be. It's not being redeemed, it's as much as being changed, and kind of moving forward in a way.
I always loved the expression that, when Jesus first went to the first disciples and he said, I will make you fishers of men. And I've always had the image that God seeks us if we're a fish. We each have different lures. We don't all want worms. We don't all want, crawfish or whatever. And that this transformation comes to something that is uniquely tailored to us. It speaks to where we are. It speaks to the need that we have, and for example, I had a tremendous forgiving a situation in my life that I just couldn't get over, and I remember sitting down with, I don't know if you've ever heard of Paula D'Arcy, but who was a woman here in Austin who was a kind of a seminar leader, and I've always found her to be a remarkable insight into humanity. But she described to me the process that she went through to forgive the man, the drunk driver, who killed her husband and her 2-year-old. And I thought, if this woman can forgive something as grievous and as extreme as that, I really wanted to hear her process. And she spent time just sitting with me, knees to knees, and and I just realized it was a story I needed to hear. Not that it was going to change how I felt, but to understand that process. It was so formative to me. And so, it changed completely how I felt about that action in my life. And just made me open to the possibility of forgiveness, which I later received and was able to do. I think so many times those kinds of personal interactions, to me, God always comes in other people. Much more that sense of the divine and human forms.
I would comment both on what Gail said and Kurt said in terms of lures, different lures for different ones of us. And Kurt saying it's different at a different time and stage in our life. So you've got variables in both of those.
I think those are both really good images, that different lures and different times. I'm just curious, one of the ones that he talks about, I think that's such a striking story in the Bible, is return from exile. And he mentions the story of Joseph, being welcomed back, the prodigal son story. And I'm just curious, do you have an experience either yourself or with somebody else? And the thing I keep thinking about, I often my husband was in the military, and I often hear him talk about his coming out of the military back into society as almost a return from exile. And it makes me think of times when we're completely separated, either physically or emotionally somehow from somebody, and then come back in and what that reentry is like. And I'm just curious if any of you have a experience yourself or with someone else where they were kind of coming back from exile, and that how that touched their faith, or how important their reception was to them in their faith walk.
Gay friends
Yeah.
over and over.
Yeah, that's true, Sally.
When I came back to Austin and First Church after 6 years in San Antonio, I mean, I said then, and I've used that term at first flippantly, but truly, I was in exile in San Antonio for 6 years, and I came back to my people and the way I understood my relationship with God, and people were so welcoming.
Yeah, exile can be physical, but sometimes the bigger part of it is the sense of separation or loss of community or loss of connection. And to have that return to us. And I think it can be a spiritual one too. I mean, I think the story is the prodigal son story is often the father is the illustration of God, right? Welcoming you back no matter how many pigs you've slept with or whatever, you know, that this is the welcome you're going to get. And that image always, to me, I don't know about you and your lives, but I've been all three characters in that story. I've been the
Yes.
older brother going, what the heck? I've been so good. How come there, you know, I've been that one. I've been the prodigal going, "Ew, I don't know if anyone will ever take me back." And now as I'm older and a parent, I'm finding I have to be the father, right? You have people in your life that go places you're afraid of, and you have to be there when they want to come back. So I think it's the whole return from exile image from a faith and a spiritual point of view is just incredibly powerful and incredibly true in life. And I guess that's one of the things I love about Borg. He helps me see the Bible as a template through which I can look at life in a much richer way than just reading the literal story. Okay, so that question didn't hit a home run with you guys, but that's all right. I've enjoyed the discussion anyway. And I thank you for your time. We're right at the end. Any comments or anything in the chapter maybe that we didn't touch on that somebody wants to mention?
I couldn't help but think every time I read this, as he goes on about, he's agnostic about, in a good sense, about what happens to us after we die, that he wrote this like a year and a half before he died, and at a time when I don't think he was sick or anything. And I can't help it but think about that. But I've always liked what he says there, and I know that makes a lot of people, like in my Monday night group, uncomfortable about why he isn't more sure about what's going to happen. But anyway.
Yeah, that's a really touching insight, Kurt. I had not thought that this is his last book, and it was written within a couple of years of his death.
Right.
And that's the fact that it was his last, and it's such a retrospective, I think, is one of the things that makes it so powerful. But I hadn't made that association. Thank you for that. Well, if you'll join me for just a second, we'll close this right on time. Father, I thank you for all these people who come together looking, helping, trying to be a group, and also trying to be your followers. I ask that you strengthen each of us and that we strengthen one another in the best possible ways as you guide us. In Christ's name I pray. Amen.